Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to all of you at the Italian user group and Roberto especially for helping organize this, inviting me along. It's been really interesting. Let me introduce myself. My name is Paul Holden. I'm based in the UK. I've worked for Moodle HQ for the last 2.5 years as a senior developer on the Moodle Workplace team. So Workplace is the corporate version of the LMS that most of you, I imagine, are familiar with. So this presentation, as you rightly said, is about Report Builder. Report Builder is and has been for some time an integral part of the Workplace product. And the intention for LMS for the new release was to migrate that functionality into Moodle. It's to bring the functionality to all Moodle users rather than just for Workplace. So some of the background on this project, myself and the Workplace team, as well as people around the globe from the LMS team, we've been working for the last 12 months on this project, which is now coming towards completion. We have been migrating parts of Moodle over to the new system reports and custom report functionality of Report Builder. For those of you who are extra keen and have been tracking some of the development work in 4.0, you may already have had a chance to test out some of the new features. Ferran did a fantastic job of explaining the timeline of 4.0, so I won't repeat that. Suffice to say that we are also on track for 4.0 with Report Builder. So the presentation I'm going to do is going to be split into two parts. I want there to be something for anyone in the room, any participant who's watching. So that will be the users. We'll talk about the user interface, how Report Builder can be used as a tool for your own sites. And then in the second half, I will split off into explaining some of the concepts and options that any developers in the audience might be particularly interested in. So Report Builder, in essence, is really two parts. There are the ability to create system reports. System reports are it's just a new reporting tool that is available now in Moodle. It's available for any plugin, any core feature, anything that basically has a report. So historically, Moodle has evolved organically over the last decade plus and has many different and quite contrasting reporting tools within it. One of the primary goals of this entire project was to try and come with a standardized reporting tool. If we do have any people who are familiar with Workplace, you will recognize a lot of what I'm going to demonstrate as we use the reporting screens I'm going to show you throughout the product. So my demos are pre-recorded, as I don't trust live demos, but what we've done here for context is, as part of the project, we've begun converting existing pages in Moodle to Report Builder. What you're looking at here isn't something new, it's an existing report. This is an administrator report for viewing task logs. And yeah, as you can see, the thing that we have kind of standardized is the ability to have consistent filtering. That was one of the things that differs quite significantly across reports. We want to eventually move towards converting more and more reports to this, which is an easy and consistent method of filtering report data. So let me describe what we're looking at. So this is a report what they all have is the ability to filter them. So we can filter by text data, by numeric data. In this example here, I am filtering a report to show me data relative to the current time with a duration which is set. I think I'm going to set it to greater than a few seconds. There's nothing particularly special about this report other than it's a demonstration of how we can really flexibly access data in Moodle. And this is all Ajax driven with a really large focus on performance, but also quite importantly is accessibility. I know that was something that Ferran touched on in his presentation, but it's something that Moodle as a product, as a company, is driving very heavily towards AA certification. And it's quite an important aspect of all web technology now, is to make sure that our content and our sites is accessible to all users. So that's system reports. You will see eventually more and more pages looking similar to the report I've just shown. So that's really the smaller component of Report Builder. The larger and I suppose most impressive part of it is the report editor that we've created. So it's all well and good that we as developers, we create these reports for users, and by and large they're fine, they work great. But there's always that little thing about, I as a user, I want a report on X, Y, and Z, or I want it to be slightly different. So what we're introducing in Report Builder is the concept of plugins or components, any part of the system providing report data to Report Builder, which allows you as users, as administrators, to create your own custom reports according entirely to your own specifications. It doesn't make any assumptions about what your report should look like. It's very flexible and it allows you to create them as you see fit, really. So what you're looking at here now is the report editor. So this is one of the report sources we have is on cohorts. So as part of the project, we have been creating example and for demonstration purposes, various sources. These are all part of Moodle now and will be part of the Moodle 4.0 release. The way it's designed, and I'll touch on this in the second part of the presentation for developers, it's entirely flexible and pluggable API, and if you have a report or you have an itch to get report data from your own plugins or from various other parts of Moodle, you can provide this data to Report Builder and it will allow a user to edit it within this page. So what I'm doing here, this is a default report. What I'm looking at now on the left-hand side are all the columns or the pieces of data for a report. I can filter that and select specific columns or pieces of data that I want to display in my report. So in this instance, it's a report of cohorts and all their users. So I'm now listing all of the users. So the interface is, we've tried to make it as intuitive as possible. Every element of the report is configurable by the end user, so we can very closely define the columns and pieces of data we want. You can easily switch between the editor and previewing the report. I'll touch more about viewing reports shortly, so just focus now on the editor. And after adding my columns, I can define how I want them to be sorted. So really you're in full control of what it is, the pieces of data that you want to present to users. Again, with this, it's important that we've kept it accessible, and a lot of work actually very recently has just been completed by my colleague Mikel on all of this. So we can remove, drag and drop, add columns as we see fit, and this builds up our report. I believe now I'm going to start some aggregation. If any of you are familiar with similar products of reporting data, any spreadsheet gurus, you'll be familiar with these. So we can aggregate, can be, as you see it here, counting pieces of data, concatenating it together. For numeric column types, you can perform mathematical aggregation on them. This is another very flexible thing that allows you to do whatever you want. It's the possibilities are only limited by yourself. And this is the core of it, really. This is the column editor. I will carry on in some of the subsequent videos about some of the other options that we have here. So it's not only can we create reports, and the important thing is we've created these things is we allow people to view them. We're not just creating them in a void, in a black box. So what we have designed is a system. Now let me just see what I'm showing here. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Right, so we have a report. I'm going to talk now about what we can do with conditions and filters. I'll pause the video and just talk about what they are and the subtle difference. So a condition is a clause that you put on a report to limit the data. So if I continue now, we can see what that actually means in practice. So here we have a drop down. We can see all of the conditions that are available. So all of the things you see here, the conditions and the columns, they are all defined by the source of the data. So this is a rather nonsensical condition. I've said that I only want to display data where the category is not equal to the system. But in fact, in this demo, all of the categories are in the system. And here we are now. So you can add as many conditions as you want. Really, the conditions is a way or a means of you as a report editor to restrict the data that's being displayed. Or maybe you only deliberately want to display data about a certain user, a certain course, anything really. And now we come to the filter. So this is a subtle difference. Let me pause there. Conditions are absolutely applied. They can't be changed by a user. What we're doing by adding filters is providing an additional means for users when they're viewing the report to further reduce or restrict the amount of data they're using, effectively allowing to search for specific data in a report. So here we are looking at the default filters. We can manage them just like we can with columns. We can drag and drop, rename, move them around. And this is a list. Any piece of data really is filterable. I'm adding a new filter for a user there. And the effect that this has, when we are viewing or previewing a report, all the filters that I've defined when editing it are now available here. And this is where now the user who's viewing your report is in control of the data and can search by using the filters for whatever it is that they're looking for. This is a rather generic report, but it does demonstrate hopefully what you can do with them. With any report in Report Builder, you have got the Ajax interactions, ability to download and export all the data. So the exporting of data is quite important, and in fact it's quite useful that any report, be it a system or custom report, you can always access and export that data for long-term storage really. So for any reason whatsoever really, you can download it in however you want it. So this last part of the editor, this is the card view. This is more like how you might define the responsive view. So the responsive view would be how your report is viewed on a narrow device. So typically you're looking at mobile devices. So these are your users who are viewing report data that you've created for them on their own devices. They're on the go, they're on a tablet, they're on a mobile, and it's a way of presenting what is typically tabular data in a report in a more easily understandable format, specifically for narrow devices. So it's a really simple form. I'll now bring in this demonstration. So what I have here, I'm viewing the report that I've created. What you will see now as I narrow the device to emulate, as I narrow the window to emulate a narrow device, you'll see how the card view or responsive view comes into effect in that it transforms what was tabular data into the card view, as we call it. And it's really nice. It's very usable. Again, it's accessible and it's an easier way to view reports. And that's the card view. So everything that you've seen is completely flexible, controlled by you. Right, okay, so let's continue. You've created your report. It's great, it works fine, but you want to allow other people to access your report. And that's the point of it. It's no good just creating it and not doing anything with it. What you can do now is define who can access your report. This is something I'll touch on for developers. For now, I think it's fine to just say this is entirely pluggable and extendable as well. So really, if you can imagine some way of uniquely identifying users, an obvious one might be a user profile field or some custom data you're storing about your users, perhaps assignment of badges, basically a means to identify users. It can be converted into an audience to grant access to your reports. In this case, I am going to say that anybody in this cohort can access my report. So within the report editing page that we're on now, we have the audience and the access tabs. That's it. So here are all the users that I can access my report. Should I log in now as any of the users that I have granted access to my reports, I will see this report as I've designed it. We can add multiple audiences. Again, it's entirely flexible. It doesn't make any assumptions about who should access reports. It's down to the user who's creating the report. Switching to the Access tab, this is now the combination of all of the audiences that I've added to this report. So the second thing that we can do with audiences, which I believe is starting now, let's assume we have a report and we've created it, it works well, but it's quite an important report. We don't want to necessarily rely on users to actively go and look at this report. What we can do is create schedules for a report. What a schedule is it's a means to distribute the reports that you've created to subsets of your users as you see fit, basically. Again, it makes no assumptions about how it should be done. What we do, we can create a schedule. Let me just pause it there. What this is doing is creating like a list of users who will receive this emailed report according to how you set this form up. So if I just progress through, I'll briefly talk what it is that we're doing here. So the format is the type of file that you want to send to the user. So do you want to send a spreadsheet, a PDF? It's up to you. It will be generated as you see fit. We define when we want to start sending it and how often. How often is defined here. So if we just want to send a one-off report, we don't want to send it on a recurring schedule, we can set that here. But what we might want to do is, so this report will be sent Sunday morning. So if we were to set it to weekly, every Sunday morning until we stop the schedule, it will be sent to the users. So this you could imagine being very useful for sending, for instance, completion reports, attainment reports to students or to faculty staff. It could be used for automating a lot of information that you're sending to your users, both administration staff, faculty or students. So what we can do here is define how the report is generated. So you may have created a report that has a condition related to the current user. So what that means would be that each user sees their own version of the report. So maybe I'm a user, Paul, I come log in and I see my own attainment at certain activities or courses. But then another student logs in and they see their own. So what we can do here is we can send a customized version of each report to each user, so it's specific to them. Alternatively, we can send a report to other users as if viewed by your head of finance, for instance, or any user. It depends on the intention and the content of the report. So here we are selecting an audience or a group of users that we want to send this report to. And this is self-explanatory. This is the email content. The final option, and this is entirely optional, what do we want to do if the report contains no data? If you can imagine you've created a report for a very specific event that's happened within the past week, for instance, and you don't want to send potentially an empty report every week if that event hasn't happened. So there are different options depending on, to cover as many outcomes as we can imagine. So here we are, we can enable and disable a schedule from this point. And if we are quite impatient or we just want to test something, we don't need to actually wait for the date to start the schedule. We can just go ahead and send that immediately. That, in essence, covers most of the functionality that is in Report Builder. What I've shown is what's in, well, will be, and is currently actually in the 4.0 release. What would be great, and this isn't necessarily aimed just at developers, it could be at any users, is to, here for the 4.1 release, is to start getting together now plans for what is the report data that users, teachers, administrators are likely to want to get out of Moodle. These are unknown questions. These are the questions that come, the answers come from actual users of the system. But that's our aim for future releases, is to get more and more report data into the Report Builder tool. So that was the interface. That's what I wanted to demonstrate and hopefully cover for users, for how you could start thinking about what kind of data do I want to access, what can I access, what would be useful for my users, what would be useful for me. In a former life, I was an administrator for a Moodle site, so I can recognize a lot of needs for report data that typically ended up by just accessing the database directly. And these are the type of things we want to bring into the hands of actual users with the front end to remove that necessity of asking your DBA to pull up this report. If we can present that data in a useful manner in Moodle itself, we put the power of, or the control of that in the user's hands. Okay, this point in the presentation, I will follow the lead of Farron and switch to talking about more of the developer aspects of the tool. It's not going to be in perhaps as much detail, but what I will do towards the end is link some resources that we have, some actual prep work that we've done for this Moot, in order to share resources with the community, specifically everybody here, and have some tools and guides that will help any developers who are interested in getting involved in working, either contributing with their own changes or working directly with us. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, the entire project has lasted over 12 months now, I believe. So myself, David, Mikkel, and the whole of the workplace team have been involved, as well as quite a lot of input from the LMS team, the integration team, specifically the accessibility experts. It's been not just an effort from myself and my colleagues, it's been the whole developer team has been involved in this. So some of the parts of this presentation will overlap with what I've already explained. So I won't spend too long covering the same ground that I've already spoken about. But it's two major components, the system reports and the custom reports, both of which we hope to expand their usage across Moodle with subsequent releases. So specifically, the issue that we have been, David, my colleague, has been working on for this Moot was the conversion of the cohort reports to system reports. So what we've tried to do here is use it as a guide for anybody who's interested in doing something similar, either contributing those changes to Moodle or just in their own local environments or own plugins, piece of code that they have for their own organizations. So this issue at the bottom, MDL 73141, I'll find a way to provide all these links afterwards for anybody who is interested. This is the issue that has been specifically created for this Moot as a demonstration. But this is the report. This is the report that we've created. It's a system report, and the intention of it was to show that the conversion to this to gain all of the nice Ajax sorting features, all the pagination, the accessible usage, the interface elements and filters, it's not actually a lot of work. It doesn't require a huge amount of refactoring or code. This diagram sort of explains the components or the elements that make up a system report. They're also extremely similar to the elements that make up a custom report. The two things are almost interchangeable. The base elements for each are identical. So from your perspective as a developer, you aren't rewriting large parts of code twice, basically. If you can write parts of code for a system report, there is very, very little code you need to write to then convert that into a custom report to present that data to the report editor. So a report, system or custom, is comprised of entities. Entities are your columns and your filters. So these are exactly what we saw in the report editor. These are all provided by the entities. Here we are. You could think of entities as reusable classes, as in fact, that is what they are. It's a class that defines elements of a report. So the entity class defines columns, filters, conditions, and these are all really the building blocks of a report. Once you have an entity of columns and pieces of data, it's very simple to pull that entity into any report and make use of any of the elements within it. So for instance, we have created common entities. So we've got a user, a course, cohorts, various different entities already. So the code for getting user data is already written. If we are writing new reports, we can very easily pull that data into our own reports without having to re-implement anything ourselves. One of the goals of this entire project was to make the end user API, that is the APIs that third-party developers will be using, as straightforward and requiring the minimum amount of boilerplate code as possible. As part of the links at the end of the presentation, I will link to the API documentation. This presentation itself goes through a lot of the abstract methods, the pieces of code that you're likely to need to implement. I think this is more useful as a reference after the fact when you are working on this code to refer to this presentation. Again, I'll find means of making this presentation available. I think it'd be a useful resource for anyone who is interested in this. But we're going through here the methods that we are expected to implement. So what are the tables that we're going to use? How do we identify these tables? The entity title, this is, again, how do we identify the entity? What's it called basically in code? And this is very small method. This is where we define all of the pieces of data that are entity exposures to reports, really. Now we're down to the nitty-gritty. What is a column? What is a filter? A column is a piece of data. A column is a representation of a piece of SQL syntax. In the examples here, the SQL syntax is quite straightforward. It's selecting a single field from a table. You can see some of the methods on the column instance there. So we're defining what type of data is it? Is it a number? Is it a string? Now, this is quite important because that defines how it can be aggregated. So integers, numeric data can have mathematical operations performed on them, whereas obviously string types can't. I suppose one thing that is of note with columns and actually with filters. So in the entire project, we've abstracted away as much as we can possibly do the subtle differences that will likely trip developers up in differences between database engines. So when I say that, I mean each engine has its own rather peculiar ways of doing certain operations. Some operations which are intuitive and easy in Postgres or MySQL. They are just not possible in Oracle SQL Server. A lot of that's abstracted away. Where that's not abstracted away, there are API methods to control in a column how that column behaves depending on the type of database that the user may have. And so this is especially important when you are contributing code, either in a plugin that you can't depend on the underlying database engine, or especially if you're contributing code to LMS, there is a requirement it needs to work on any supported database. Typically, you don't need to think about this, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind when you are writing potentially very complex columns that do their own subqueries or joins. This is explained in the API documentation. I just wanted to note here that it's just something to be aware of. A filter is very similar to a column. You give it a piece of SQL. Again, this is a very simple and straightforward example. We're giving it a single field from a table, but this can be as complex as you like. It can be a subselect. It can be an operation on the database fields yourself to transform them to something else and then filter on the result of that. It's very flexible, and again, I keep coming back to it. It doesn't make any report builder doesn't make any assumptions of how it should be defined. You can be as creative as you want here. So this is exactly what I was just talking about. These are your columns. This is a typical means of creating a column. So we can call back. A callback is a method that is executed on the return SQL to format the data. So you can imagine if you were selecting a date, you don't want to just display a raw Unix timestamp to a user. You want to format it into a easily consumable piece of data, like a normal date string a human would expect to read. So I mentioned briefly about the different types of columns, and they are here. It's just very useful to be consistent and define the types of columns because that affects various other parts of the system. Again, a lot of this is abstracted away. So if you define the column type correctly, Report Builder will do a lot of the work for you with that column as far as it's possible. And this is an example. This is a nice example. And I think it's actually a real example from Moodle of selecting multiple fields for an individual column and then formatting each of those pieces of data separately. So you define your fields. The callback takes both of those fields as arguments, and then it can return a piece of content, really. It can be text, or it can be, in this case, it can be formatted in div elements. You can even return, and in fact, if you look at the code and the API documentation, you will see examples of where some columns actually display pictures, or so you're really not limited to just displaying textual data. You can display user images, anything really. Yeah, so part of the work on columns is a general understanding of SQL syntax. Where do you get the data from? If the data is from a different table, we need to add a join to that table. There are examples of this. The joins are all normalized before the report is executed, which means it's very safe for multiple columns to join on the same tables. Those joins will be normalized away, and it won't become a terrible performance burden if you were using multiple columns all joining the same table. These are just real helper methods. Can your column be sorted? Most pieces of data can be sorted. Some potentially piece of data doesn't make sense to sort. You can't really sort pictures. And this is one of the limitations in certain database systems. So this is Oracle. There are limitations on what type of data it can sort. Again, if this comes back to defining your column, and Report Builder will do its best to do the correct thing for the database engine. Whether a column is available. This is, as it says, whether the current user has rights to see the current column. So you can create reports, and depending on the rights of the current user, it will vary what is displayed to them. So we saw the filters. This is what a filter dialog looks like. It's quite, from a user's perspective, it's very, very easy. We use these consistently throughout the workplace product, and where we have implemented Report Builder in LMS, they're quite consistently used there. Yeah, as I said, a filter is an SQL fragment that is applied, that has the result of this filter form applied to it. The implementation is quite straightforward. If you look at some of the examples, we're defining here how the filter is should be, how the piece of data should be filtered. So here we have a date. What this means is that it will allow the user to perform date operations on the piece of SQL. And these are some of the types. I believe actually since this presentation was created by my colleague, we have expanded the number of filter types we have. But these are your common means to filter data. We can filter text, dates, everything on this list. Really, some of them are quite straightforward. So basically here we're providing a UI for doing equality checks, or if you think of it in SQL terms, like clauses. And that's very straightforward. The date filter allows you to set absolute dates, or you can do relative dates. You could do a filter for all events within the past week, the past month, or if you were looking forward in your data, all events in the next year, for instance. Numbers, quite straightforward. You can perform numeric operations on a piece of data. All of this is handled in the background by Report Builder. It requires very, very little code actually on your part or on our part as third-party developers to implement all of this. And select, so if you have a predefined list, imagine there's a filter for the user's country, so the available options are the list of countries. It's quite straightforward. If you read the API documentations, there are various tricks that you can use as well. Not so much tricks, but recommendations for writing performant filters. So how to squeeze the last ounce of performance out of your code. It's quite useful to be aware of those. This is to allow you to select courses. There's a similar one for users as well. This diagram is identical to the one I think I already showed. Now we're talking about system reports. As you can see, and I will point at the examples that we have for this presentation, it's very, very straightforward to create your report and then pull in data from entities. So in essence, this is a system report here. It's a system report on one table, which is the task log table, and then it pulls in the user entity to get all of the data it needs about the user related to each task log. It's I suppose once you get the concept and you recognize the pattern, it becomes very quick and straightforward to create new reports. This is what the report does. So each column is uniquely identified by the entity, and all your system report in essence needs to do is say which columns and which filters it wants, and Report Builder will go ahead and take that and then create a report. In fact, just looking at this, I recognize this from the task log report, which was the one at the beginning of the presentation. So that would be an example to look at. This is an example of a report that not only wants to pull in data from existing entities, it wants to define its own custom columns, which might not necessarily be generic enough to belong to an entity, but might be required for this report's purposes. And this is also an example of using a slightly more complex piece of SQL for retrieving the data. So it's just a count query to count the number of cohort members. So one thing that's interesting, so security is, it's not, obviously it's a very, very important thing, but it's not something that you need to spend too much time with reports concerned about. A lot of work has been done to make that as easy as possible for you to implement. So the reason for this method is that most of Report Builder is Ajax driven. So it's not enough to just confirm that the user is able to view a report when initially rendering it in the first place. We need to continually check that every time they page or they perform sorting or do perform filtering, that we're also validating that this hey, is this user actually able to view this report? I mean, you could write this in, it's only 2 lines of code. It's very simple. Any of you who are familiar with the capability and context system in Moodle should recognize what this is. This is, what do we call our report? This was the example previously, that this is how we add our columns from our entities. Very, very little amount of code that we are actually required to write. Exactly the same with filters. So everything that I've talked about, how we have entities, columns, filters, conditions, they are interchangeable between system reports and custom reports. What system reports also have are these call to action buttons, so or action classes. What this allows you to do is define actions that can be performed relative to each row of the table. This is an example of defining those actions. It may look quite a lot of code. In fact, that is almost the same piece of code replicated 3 times, but it's a good demonstration of how we add these actions to reports. And it demonstrates whether the current user is able to perform that action. So we have a callback that just returns Boolean. Can user X perform this action, yes or no? If they can, then this action will be presented to the user. And all it really is give it a URL, in this case, and an icon, which is used to render the action icon. So these examples here are all straightforward, very straightforward links to other pages. What is also nice is to be able to hook these into Ajax and JavaScript interactions. As you click around in all of Report Builder, you'll find that it's moving the interface into Ajax and responsive actions. So no more waiting for long page reloads, re-rendering the page, losing your position on the page. So it's very good, and you'll see examples of how we do that in some of the code, and just clicking around Report Builder, you'll see how we interact with these report actions. A couple more things that we can do. By default, any report in Report Builder is downloadable. If you have a case where you are providing report data and you've determined that no, it doesn't make any sense to download this data, that's on you. There's no problem with that. There's a method to disable whether the report is downloadable or not. And we can also define how the report is sorted. So this is only defining how it's sorted initially. A user can always, by clicking on the column, sort it in their own way. One small thing, that each column defined by an entity has a name. Of course, the name is sensible in most cases, but you may want to change it to something else, and that's also entirely possible. Very flexible. This is an example of using the same entity twice. You could imagine a report that is reporting on actions performed on a user. Perhaps you want to include in the report information on the user performing the action and the user having the action performed on them. So all we need to do is rename each entity, and it can be used, the same entity type can be used multiple times. What this presentation now is going into is pretty much what I was demonstrating through the recordings at the beginning. So it's drag and drop. Accessibility was very high in sort of importance of what we needed to achieve. This is what it looks like. This screen will become very familiar. It will be very familiar for any workplace customers or people who are already using the master branch from Moodle. And yeah, this is talking about the different options. I explain the difference between conditions and filters, and what we can do with the report. And this is a good definition of what the differences is. It's quite subtle, and I understand it can, yeah, it can take you a while to really get your head around the difference between them. This will all come in documentation, as Ferran stated in his earlier presentation. Once the 4.0 docs wiki is created, this is when we can start really going to town on all this documentation. There's a good definition of audiences. Audiences are very flexible. It's entirely down to the person creating the report to define who they want to be able to access the report. Just on that point, there are capabilities to define. So as an administrator, you can define who can create reports and who can view reports. We don't suppose exactly how your system is set up, but you can define that using the normal capability system of Moodle, who can do what. This is the audiences, who can access a report, and the schedules. So if anybody is tracking the master branch, the schedules are the next large feature that will land. So that's currently on our, when I say our the workplace team's integration branches, and at the point that that is ready, that will be then pushed forward to LMS and will become part of the product. It's quite straightforward. So when I talk about the work that we're doing, the issue here 70343, this is the epic that has been open for, must be over 12 months now, but all of our work that we have been doing and the work that's remaining for 4.0 is in there. So if you are interested to see what's left to do or upcoming issues, then that's worth looking at. If I just go now to my browser, so these are the issues, and these are all the links that I want to share afterwards. I will speak to the Moot organisers about how we do that. A lot of green ticks there. Specifically for this presentation, this was the task that we wanted to use to highlight the process that one would need to go through to convert existing code to system reports. I won't go through it individually. This can be left as an exercise for anybody who is interested. But the repository here is really well detailed and defines specifically the different considerations and aspects for development that need to take place. There are a lot of commits there, but there isn't actually that much code, which is actually really nice to see. The API doesn't require you to create an enormous amount of code. The current user documentation we do have for Report Builder is part of the workplace documentation. This is all part of the Moodle Docs Wiki, and of course, anybody is welcome to browse through this, but this does describe pretty well what hopefully I've covered. Is a good reference point. And finally, for the developers, we do have the API documentation. Like any developer who's written API documentation, it becomes fairly quickly out of date, but we do and are making a conscious effort to make sure that this is kept up to date. And certainly by the time 4.0 is released, this will hopefully become a good reference point for anybody, not just ourselves, but to share with the community, with any development team about how they can go about creating something for Report Builder. That's all I had to say. I know I've gone on a long time. I hope that whether you're a Moodle user or a developer, that's something you can take away from that. And please do ask any questions or get in touch, or just imagine how you might use it in the future and create any issues you have on the tracker.